May the Lord be with you. Amen. As we look at this text today, we're going to be paying attention to some deep foundational things in the Christian faith. This isn't a question of, what's the application today? Am I supposed to go out and do such and such a thing? We're not looking at particular applications. We're looking at deep foundational things about the Christian faith. As Holly invited you at the start of this service, as I preached on this text, pay attention to the themes. I'll be talking about people, land, and blessing. Listen along those three themes to hear, is there one of these that God is trying to draw my attention to? That in my life, I need to pay attention to what he's saying through this text so that I can respond to the Spirit, so that I can live in the light of Jesus Christ. So pay attention and listen this morning carefully as we open this word, for it is the word of God. Now we're in a series on Abraham and God's plan to redeem all creation, all humanity. The fall happens in Genesis 3 and 4. And so how is God going to respond to all that? And that's what these three sermons on Abraham are going to be about. God's response to the fall. How is he going to redeem humanity? And it's to prepare us for the series on Galatians. We're going to go through Galatians until Advent. And as we go through Galatians, we're really trying to pay attention to the verse in Galatians where it says, walk by the Spirit. What does Paul mean to walk by the Spirit? What is he inviting us into? By paying attention to these foundational things that the text on Abraham draws us into, we're going to be better able to hear what Paul is inviting us into when he calls us to walk by the Spirit. Today, how will God redeem fallen humanity and creation? This idea from last Sunday about being a blessing, how far is God willing to take that? How far will God go? We have to remind ourselves about the fall first. In order to pay attention to what God is doing, we remind ourselves of the fall. The fall of humanity brings curses in three ways. Curses upon humanity's relationship with God, humanity's relationship with each other, and humanity's relationship with the land. With the relationship to God, you see that the people in the garden were then hiding from God. Adam and Eve were hiding from God, no longer walking with God. Can you see this brokenness in our world today? The people of our world do not have a good relationship with God. There is denial that God exists. There is a twisting of who God is and our relationship to him. It is broken and fallen. And then the second one, relationships to one another. Am I my brother's keeper? This question rings out from the third chapter of Genesis. Am I my brother's keeper? If we look around our world today, we see that we, as human beings, resoundingly answer that question and say, no, I am not my brother's keeper. Can you see that brokenness in our world today? The people of our world do not keep their brothers and sisters. We have war. We have slavery in its modern forms. We have crushing debt, food shortages, hoarding, and more ways of dehumanizing someone else for our own gain and our own comfort. And then thirdly, relationship to the land. The curse falls upon humanity, and it means that the land will produce thorns, that we will not have a good relationship with the land. Can you see the brokenness of the human relationships with the land in our world today? We are poisoning our land, and the land is producing thorns. One of the reasons that many people do not believe the Christian faith is because there's this idea that if God is all-powerful and if God is good, and I look at the world as it is, I cannot see that God is all-powerful and good. Why would he not do anything here? What the text today invites us into is a realization of the reality, how far will God go in his plan of redemption? People, land, and blessing. In response to the curse that is falling upon us, he brings blessing. And in response to death, he brings the seed, the offspring that he promises to Abraham. The text tells us that Abraham's response when he hears God's promise is to say, but it doesn't look like I'm experiencing that promise, God. There is no heir for me and Sarai. And the land is full of people. The text ends by saying, and there was a whole list of people in that land. And the text also tells us that Abraham's descendants are going to be 400 years in slavery. This is not a short time. It's 10 generations. Oh, bother, to quote Winnie the Pooh. So, oh God, how far will you go to redeem fallen creation? Well, a deep sleep happens. The last time we saw this deep sleep in the Bible was just a few short chapters before this. We're in Genesis 15. A few short chapters before, Adam goes into a deep sleep. And out of Adam's deep sleep, we see woman, the partner. Out of this deep sleep of Abraham, a nation will issue forth. A nation from slavery. What God is proposing here is not a speedy redemption. Abraham leaves his land and has to walk this way with God. We are walking with God, and that's why Paul uses that metaphor. It's a metaphor that isn't just, it's a way of saying live with God or live by the Spirit, but the speed of walking is actually really crucial. God's redemption is not immediate. It actually begins with the chosen people going into slavery for 400 years, with the land that is full of people. Jesus comes to earth and he walks. It is the speed of God's redemption. Sometimes it's far too slow for us. We would wish it was a lot faster. But this text also tells us, as Abraham is in that deep sleep, how far God will go. How committed is he to this redemption? Well, it happens in terrible darkness. The text tells us a terrifying darkness fell upon Abraham in his deep sleep. This is pregnant with tension, with drama. What happens is the cutting of a covenant. The word for treaty involves cutting. So you cut a covenant. And the format here that Abraham experiences, I don't know, did you read this text in Sunday school? I remember as an adult reading this text. Did I just, miss this part of the Bible? This is super bizarre. So Abraham cuts a bunch of animals in half and lines them out as a path. The birds he doesn't cut, but they're in the path as well. Of course, vultures want to come down and partake of the feast, but he says, no, this isn't for you. Does this happen anywhere else? It turns out this is how you cut a treaty. So if you have two nations, you have one nation that's more powerful, and you have one nation that is less powerful, and you're going to cut a treaty between them. So you cut a bunch of animals, and you make this path. And then what happens is, after you've set the terms, you set the terms first, where you kind of come to an agreement, and one of the nations is a little bit more powerful than the other one. You set the terms, the covenant between these two nations. The more powerful nation probably is going to protect and care for the smaller nation. The smaller nation is probably going to say, well, I will come to your defense. Should you need to attack something, I'll be there. So there's a reciprocal relationship between them. How do you bind the covenant? You bind the covenant by having the less powerful group, maybe their king, goes through the animals. And what's happening there is you're saying, if I fail to keep this covenant, for example, if you are under attack in the larger nation and you need help and you call for me and I don't come, if I fail to keep the covenant as the smaller nation, may I be like these animals. May I be split in two. May I be ended and terminated. What happens in this text? Abraham is in a deep sleep. He has no ability to participate in the ritual. Instead, he sees a smoking pot. The smoking pot represents God. And the smoking pot passes between the animals. God is saying, if you can't keep this covenant, may the consequences be upon me. How did we not read this text more? Right from Genesis 15, God says, if you can't keep this covenant, it's on me. Why is it so important that God makes this covenant in this way? It is crucial. Well, it's so important because what do humans do with covenants? Okay, well, let's just take just a quick survey of the Bible. We'll start with Noah. Okay, Noah, there's a covenant with God and all people. I'm not going to hit the great reset button again. Noah's like, great, that's fantastic. He goes out and he gets drunk and something incredible, shameful happens. Not a great start. Okay, Moses is doing a new covenant with the people that have come out of Israel, and he's up on the, what are you guys doing down at the bottom of the mountain? I didn't even get down the mountain, and you've already broken the covenant. All you had to do was wait. How about the covenant with David? Did we do better there? David has a covenant that there will be a king on the throne of Israel in this wonderful nation, and your son will build the temple, and Judah and Israel, the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom, they'll be united, it'll be wonderful, and it lasts one king, and then it breaks apart. Okay, did we do any better with the new covenant? This is the new covenant in my blood, says Jesus, and he has 12 men invited to the table. 12 men representing the 12 tribes of Israel. This is the new covenant in my blood. Drink from it, all of you. And then Judas goes out and betrays him. We do not have a good record with covenants. So it's incredibly important that God commits in this way in Genesis 15, that if we break the covenant, the consequences are on him. This is how far God will commit to his redemption plan. This is how far God will commit to redeeming all people and all creation. Amen. How does this affect his promises to Abraham? He promises, and these are the themes of the book of Genesis: land, people, and blessing. What is God's commitment here in Genesis 15? How does that change his gifting of land, people, and blessing? Well, let's start with people. What qualifies a person as one of these descendants of Abraham? Shortly after this, there's going to be circumcision. It's introduced as the sign or symbol of the covenant. Notice that the promise happens before Abraham is circumcised. Now, the circumcision comes as that sign or symbol of the covenant, and in Abraham's people, not just the people of his seed, right? It's not just his direct descendants. He has none at this point. But it's all the people of his household, and it's the Gentiles who were with him. They all get circumcised. Moses, the law comes in after the people leave Egypt. And the goal of the law was to signify and differentiate the people so you could tell who are the chosen people. It's really important so that we can tell these are the chosen people, and they're responding to the revelation of God so that others can see what it looks like to live in relationship with God. So we're differentiating them. But what happens? We notice in that law that there's this inclusion of those who aren't in it in subtle ways. The law says that on your Sabbath, all those who sojourn with you should also be included in Sabbath. Sabbath is one of the major defining terms of the people of God. And what the law says is, if you have a sojourner with you, if you have a visitor with you, make sure that they can participate in Sabbath too. Don't make them work. They need to be able to experience this great blessing of God as well. And then along comes David. David has these cool, mighty men. I love the stories of David's mighty men. They're inspiring. Did you notice their names? Did you notice where they're from? They're Hittites. They're Jebusites. That list that Holly read for us basically is the same list of people of David's mighty men. In David's kingdom, you enter into it and you participate in it. And you know what? Your birthplace, you're just as much born in Jerusalem as the next person. You're part of the people of God. Yahweh promised fertility to Abraham and Sarah. But they didn't realize it right away. They didn't see it. He had to give up his fleshly hope in order to have faith in God, right? This isn't going to happen as the normal ways. He has to kind of give that up in order to have faith with God. We see the same issue with Gideon. Gideon goes around providing fleeces, and God's like, you're missing the point. That's not how you figure out what I'm doing by using fleeces. I'm just going to keep showing you that it has nothing to do with you and everything to do with dependence on me. You're going to try again, Gideon? Fine. Then I'm going to give you less people. You want to try again? Fine. I'm going to give you less people. Abraham, you want to try to make babies without me? I'm just not going to make it work for you. No, not that way. Not with your slave girl. No, you're doing it wrong. You have to have full and complete dependence on me. God's making a point. He's making a point through Sarah's barrenness that the right response to God's promise of people is trust and faith. In Ezekiel, he says, these dry bones, Ezekiel speaks with God, and he says, God says to Ezekiel, there's these dry bones, and I could make them rise up and be the people of God if I wanted to. John the Baptist comes in contact with some people who are wondering, how are you going to be a good witness to God? And John says, you think you're the children of Abraham? If God wanted to, he could make these stones cry out, Abba, Father. The people of Abraham, are they Hebrews? The word meaning wanderer, somebody connected to Abraham, but it seemed a little amorphous? Or is it the Israelite, the ones of that kingdom? Or is it Jew, the direct descendants that can kind of claim, my father was, my father was, my father was, all the way back? Who are the chosen people, the actual descendants of Abraham? As we pay attention, as we look through the way it has been expanded in the Bible, it's not an ethnic category or a blood category. It's a theological category. It's about trust and faith. And Jesus picks up on this in Luke 4. When he says to his hometown, many widows were in Israel. Elijah was sent to a widow in Sidon, which is not Israel. There were many lepers in Israel, but Elisha was sent a leper from outside of Israel, and that leper was cleansed, the Syrian. God's grace extends to people who are not necessarily as in as we might think. The chosen ones is what Jesus is saying in that moment, is that the chosen people of God are the ones who need to accept that they are so spiritually needy, that they are, in fact, sinful and needing forgiveness. And so, of course, if you're the chosen people, thinking that, no, we're not sinners because we're children of Abraham. We're not sinners like the Gentiles. And you hear Jesus say that the people of God that have descended from Abraham is a bigger category than you think it is. And it's based upon faith and trust. You're going to want to kill Jesus, aren't you? He's changing those categories. It's not by birth, and it's not even by circumcision. It's by circumcision of the heart. Am I my brother's keeper? In Jesus Christ, we see that Jesus says that to each one of us. Am I my sister's keeper? And Jesus says, yes, I am. Am I my brother's keeper? And Jesus says, yes, I am. And we are invited to participate in that, to be our brothers and our sisters' keeper. How far is God willing to go in his redemption of humanity in terms of the gift of people? We see in the fulfillment of Jesus, he is willing to go all the way to you. How far is God willing to go with the gift of land? What are the boundaries of the land? It's interesting here that there are some established boundaries. It's from this river to this river. It's actually a lot of land expressed in this text. What is the distance? How far is God willing to go? What land has he promised? Well, the initial vision, Genesis 1-9, is that the earth is one land. An interesting thing happens in chapter 9. A man named Peleg is born, and his name means division or dividing. The dividing of the land is part of the consequence of sin, the consequence of trying to be gods unto ourselves. The vision was initially for one land. Something that Paul picks up on later. Paul in Romans chapter 4, he looks back to Abraham and to the promise to Abraham, and he says that God's vision is so big that Abraham would inherit the world. So when Paul writes about Abraham, he sees something not just from river A to river B, but actually that God was promising to Abraham the whole world. And sure enough, if you pay attention to chapter 12, verse 3, like we did last week, when God says, and all nations, all families of the earth will be blessed through you, how big is the land where all families of the earth live? And chapter 22, again, God says to Abraham, all nations of the earth. The vision of land that Abraham is to inherit is quite a bit bigger than just river to river. As we pay attention through the Old Testament to those borders, it changes in numbers, and it's a little bit different in Exodus. The borders don't quite line up. They seem to change and morph over the course of time. In David's kingdom, in Solomon's kingdom, the borders get a little bit different again. They seem to expand a little further. Is that the land that was promised, or is it something more? My sense is, in echoing Paul here, that the vision of land that God is promising is more connected to that initial vision of one land. And we see this fulfillment when Jesus comes. Jesus comes, and what he does is he gives to his disciples marching orders. In Acts chapter 2, Lord, are we going to see the realization of your kingdom right now? And Jesus says, what I want you to do is I want you to preach the good news. I want you to preach it in Judea and Samaria, and I want you to preach it to the ends of the earth. What is the vision that God has for the fulfillment of his promise of land? It is to the ends of the earth. It isn't a geographical border. He isn't limited simply by that. His vision of blessing in land is to the very ends of the earth. In Jesus, we see the fulfillment of how far God is willing to go. Where is he willing to take this gift of land, and how deeply is he willing to commit to it? He's committing to it for all of it. And then lastly, how far does God commit to blessing? Walter Brueggemann speaks about the opening chapter of the Bible as a liturgy of abundance. I talked about this last Sunday. God's mode of operating, what does this God do? He wants to bless. He wants to bless you. And the vision from Genesis 1 is of abundance. Be fruitful and multiply. Teem among the earth. Be teeming. Be like overflowing in all the spaces. Be fruitful and multiply. The very force of God at work in the world is the force of blessing. But Adam and Eve lose sight of this. There's a little whisper in their ear. You know, I think God might be holding back on you a bit. And you start to doubt God's abundance is really for you. You start to then justify actions. You take matters into your own hands. Cain and Abel. Cain, if you just took up your issue with God and said, you know, God, it seemed like you didn't really find favor with my offering. Could you talk to me about that? Instead, Cain does what we consider very good business practice, and he eliminates the competition. Scarcity. There isn't enough, so I need to take more to get what I need. Pharaoh is the master of this. He dreams of scarcity. And as a result of that, he decides to concentrate the wealth and the power in me at the top, and for this to work, it depends on a class of people who are the slaves. Somebody has to do the work. Blessing for some, hard labor for others. And usually, if your parents were at the top experiencing blessing, then you will also get a head start towards experiencing blessing. And if your parents were at the bottom, then you will get a head start at experiencing what it means to be at the bottom. This is, sadly, an incredibly compelling vision. The worldly vision of abundance is that the people at the top have so incredibly much. And it's so much so that as you leave Egypt and walk away from it, you turn around and you're like, well, God's leading me into this wilderness, which doesn't feel like abundance. I kind of wish I was back there in Egypt. That abundance looked really attractive. I mean, I was at the bottom of the pyramid, but, maybe I could work my way up, perhaps, get some of that abundance. It's a compelling vision. It seems like it is abundant. He who dies with the most shoes wins. In my high school, Nike shoes were amazingly cool. And then I think it was like the early 2000s or so. It didn't seem as that big a deal, but maybe it was. I didn't have kids then. But then now, there's these amazing Nike shoes again. If you had bought shoes back when I was in high school and didn't wear them, did not wear them at all, and just kept them in a box, they're worth a ton now. Like you could sell them for thousands of dollars. He who dies with the most shoes unworn wins. It's a compelling vision of abundance. Imagine having a closet full of Nike shoes that you could open up and say, look at my shoes. It feels like abundance. But we have to leave that vision behind, step into the wilderness, and realize that God's blessing of abundance feels and looks differently. You leave behind Egypt and you step into the wilderness and you get manna. The word means, what is it? Which is basically every time my wife cooks for my children, what is it? Okay. This is God's abundance? Well, let's try to hoard it. Let's try to keep some. Let's see if we can build it up. Take that manna, let's make a big stack of it. Maybe we can invest it. Let's bank it. Can it grow? No. You take God's abundance and you stick it in a bank and it turns poisonous and sour. Except on the day that you're supposed to take Sabbath and take the blessing of Sabbath, and then it will keep. God's abundance can't be treated in the same way as the abundance of the world. Again, to that law about Sabbath. Abundance even for your servants. Make sure your servants have the day off. Abundance in our world, abundance according to our culture means I get to recline by the pool while people bring me drinks. Abundance in God's world means my servant gets to take the day off too. Something different is happening here. It's a communal blessing that we're invited into, not an individual practice of Sabbath. How would that change the way we approach things like businesses, resources, science and technology, agricultural practices? How far is God willing to go with blessing? What does his covenant that he cut here with Abraham tell us about how far he is willing to go with blessing? Well, we see the fulfillment in Jesus Christ. Jesus reveals to us that our host can be trusted. The doubt that you feel in your mind, as Adam and Eve did, is the abundance something that I get to experience too? The realization in Jesus Christ is that our host can be trusted. There is enough. There is enough for you to have joy and wonderful things. In Jesus Christ, we see this because of the way he interacts with people at tables. The way he says, you are welcome at the table with me. Jesus shows us that our host can be trusted because he welcomes you at the table. And Jesus shows us that our host can be trusted because at his table, there is enough for each one of us. I know for myself, I have a hard time sharing. Generosity is not something that comes easy for me. If I have a cookie, I want to eat the cookie. And if you say to me, I'd like a bite of the cookie, okay, well, can you just take a little bite? But no, you took a big bite. I'm not great at generosity with cookies. But there is enough. Even if I only get half the cookie, it's more than enough. Learning in Jesus what it means to be generous. Experiencing the blessing of God not as stuff, but experiencing the blessing of God so that abundance is a theological category. And I don't just mean, oh, it's all in your mind. Jesus tells us that the lilies of the field, think about those and how God clothes them. He wants to clothe you more beautifully than he cares about the lilies. This isn't just, well, he made sure you have a shirt. No, he wants to make sure that you are beautiful. And consider the birds. God feeds the birds. Surely he will feed you and care for you. This is something that is beyond you. It is abundance that stretches through you and beyond you. It's so easy for us to get concerned with, well, do I have the fancy things I want right now? God's abundance is so much bigger than that. And so he invites you into that theological experience of abundance that stretches beyond simply you and yourself and what you're experiencing today, to an abundance that stretches to all people, to the ends of the earth. How wonderful it is to participate in God's abundance, because suddenly you're free. You're free of all the tethers of this world that can set upon you in terms of materialism and consumerism, which are very heavy. And it frees you to be light and life, so that you can spread this experience of abundance, so that you can be somebody who works against the forces of darkness in this world that bear down upon us in ways that are actually built on scarcity. And you can be someone who is furthering what it means to live in the true abundance of God's love. How far is God willing to keep his covenant with us? In the land, with the people, and in blessing. My prayer for you is that you would be able to experience and know the depth of his commitment to you. His invitation for you to see how far he is committed to people. How far is he committed to land? And how deep is he committed to blessing? May you know this reality this week and all the days of your life, and see his deep commitment to you, that even if we fail in this covenant, that he is willing to take the cost and the consequences on himself. Thanks be to God.